everyone has joined us. So you get to know more about Sonia Fuentes. Just so you know, there will be a Q&A afterwards. You can put your question in the chat, or later you can raise your hand. So please know that. And also, Susan is going to, the other Susan is going to send everyone a link to Sonia's website, where you can get lots and lots of information about Sonia that you won't get to hear today. So I'm really privileged and honored to introduce my friend, Sonia Fuentes. She has a very fascinating and compelling life story. And so we're just going to start at the beginning. Sonia, your parents, you've told me your parents were born in the same village in Poland, but your father moved to Germany as a very young man. On a visit back to Poland, he met your mother and they subsequently married and moved as a couple to Germany, where they started a family. Your brother Herman was born, and then 14 years later, you were born. What made your family decide to leave Germany and come to the US? If you want to start with that.
I was born in Berlin, Germany in 1928. My parents at that time were the prosperous owners of a men's clothing store in Berlin. And they had my brother, who was 14 years my senior. Neither one of my parents had any education. My father couldn't read or write in any language. We had maids in our home and we were prosperous. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was named Vice Chancellor of Germany. And shortly thereafter, the atrocities against Jews began, including an incident in our own store where hoodlums came in and wanted to rob the store. And my brother called the police. My brother went to my father and said, "We have to leave Germany." And my father thought that was nuts. And he said, "Don't be ridiculous. This will blow over and everything will be fine again." So my brother left by himself and went to Antwerp, Belgium, where we had some family. And I don't know what changed my father's mind, but he sat down with a small group of Nazis and gave them our business, our home, an investment property that my father had recently bought, containing 40 apartments and 4 stores. And they gave us a fraction of their value and they said we could leave. And so we went to Antwerp, Belgium.
And then what? When you got to Antwerp, what happened?
Well, when we got to Antwerp, we didn't have, nobody in the family had the papers legal papers to remain in Belgium. And the head of one of their offices, the head of the Sûreté Publique, which is like our FBI, did not favor foreign businessmen coming to Belgium and competing with Belgian businessmen. And he was also an anti-Semite. So he wanted to have us deported to Poland, where my parents hadn't lived in 20 years. But his order was stopped by the mayor of Antwerp, a man named Camille Huysmans, who later became Prime Minister of Belgium, because he was sympathetic to the plight of the Jews. So this man, Robert Defoe, then went to the federal police and gave them an order to deport us to Poland. And when they came to our apartment to deport us, we were on the SS Western Land 2 en route to the United States.
So you got to the United States, and as I understand it, you did not know any English when you got here.
No, but why would we know English? We were living in Berlin, Germany.
Right. Nobody so how did you learn English when you got here?
First of all, my brother knew English, but my father and mother and I did not. I went to school and picked it up immediately, and not knowing English was not a problem.
Oh, that is great. And did your parents eventually become fluent in English and become English speakers?
It's a little hard to answer that. My mother's English was better than my father's, but of course we lived here many, many years and they spoke English.
Good. And I understand you were a good student. Is that correct?
I was generally first in my class and graduated as valedictorian of my high school class.
And where was that? Where did you graduate high school?
Monticello, New York, in the Catskill Mountains of New York.
Okay. Had you always planned to go to college?
Never.
Well, what made you change your mind?
Well, at that time, when I was graduating and going to high school, young women, generally by the time they were 17 or 18, first of all, many of them got married, raised a family, or if they or before they got married, there were a small number of jobs they could work at. They could be a saleswoman, they could be a librarian, they could be an actress, they could be a typist, a secretary. So at that, I planned to be a secretary. And I took typing in high school, and I liked it very much, but a couple of things happened. First of all, when I was starting high school, I had a choice of two majors to pick. One was Introduction to Business, and the other one was college entrance. So I chose Introduction to Business because I planned to become a secretary. And I had a teacher who came to me and said, Sonia, you have to go into the college entrance section. You don't belong in the Introduction to Business section. And I argued with her because I planned to be a secretary. I had never seen a college in my life. To my knowledge, no one in my family had ever graduated from high school, including my brother, because we left Germany. So I didn't give any thought to college, but this teacher kept after me. So I finally switched to the introduction to the college entrance major. And then a second thing happened. One of my male classmates, who did not have any kind of special relationship with me, and I don't know why this happened, came to me, and he said that he was going to the next town called Middletown, New York, to take a college scholarship for a college. And you had to pay $7 to take that scholarship. But if you won it, you got $400. And he invited me to go with him. So I said, I don't know if I can go because this costs $7. I have to ask my father if I can go. So I went to my father and I asked him, and he misunderstood. He thought you pay $7 and you get $400. So he said to me, didn't know why I was asking him. Of course I should go. So I went with this guy, Jake Nemerson. We took the exam and I won the scholarship. So I don't know if there were others too. I don't know how many won that scholarship. It was called the George Lefevre Scholarship. So I was so excited that I was a winner, and I ran in to tell my dad, and he didn't understand what the excitement was about because that was his understanding in the first place, that you pay $7 and you get $400. So because I got that scholarship, I then took another scholarship that was being given called the New York State Scholarship, and I won that too. So, and then also I had, I once spoke to a classmate who was a friend of mine, and in the ladies' room, and she asked me if I planned to go to college, and I told her absolutely not. I would be happy to graduate from high school, which was more than anybody in my family had ever done, and then I would get a secretarial job. And she said, well, she was going to go to college and she was going to do this and that. So I started to think about college. She, on the other hand, left for college, went to the first year, came back to Monticello, married a hometown guy, and it's still in that town.
So what did you study when you did go? Where did you go? Where did you go to college?
Well, I went to Cornell.
And go ahead.
I applied to only 2 colleges. People told me that you didn't have to apply to 2 more. One was a small college called Hartwick. And so I turned down Hartwick and I decided to go to Cornell.
And when you got to Cornell, what did you study? What did you have a particular major or just a general studies? What did you do?
Well, I really didn't know. Well, let me take it back. I started out majoring in languages. Because of my European background, by the time I was 6, I spoke German and Yiddish and Flemish when we lived in Antwerp, and then English when we came to America. So I liked languages. So I thought I would major in languages, and I could see myself as an interpreter at the United Nations. So I began, and also I had 6 years of Latin in high school and in college, and I loved Latin. So I was going to major in languages and be a translator at the UN. So I did that for about a year. And then I realized that if you major in languages and all you're doing is translating what someone else is saying. And that didn't seem to me to be sufficient of a profession. So I switched from languages in my 2nd year, and I became a psych major. And I enjoyed psychology very much until somewhere along the line, somebody said to me, if you want to do anything in psychology, you need to get a graduate degree, a master's, and probably a doctorate. So I said, oh, no, nobody in my family ever graduated from high school. If I graduate from college, I'm certainly not going to go beyond that. And the other thing that troubled me was that because I came from another country and started school over here, I was 18 when I graduated from high school. And it seemed to me most of my classmates were 17. So I said that I wouldn't be able to do graduate work because when I graduated from college, I'd be 22, and that was too old. So then I went through a desperate stage where I didn't know what to major in because I no longer was interested in languages. Psych was no good because I had to do graduate work. So then I found out that Cornell had a graduate school of business and public administration, which was a 2-year school, but you could take your first year as your senior year of college. You'd have to go the 2nd year. So that's what I did. I went to the Graduate School of Business and Public Administration, and that was my senior year of college.
And then what did you do? So it was your senior year of college, and you graduated, and then what happened?
Well, before I graduated, I had gotten myself a job at a department store in New York City called McCreary's. It was some kind of a training position. But before you got to the higher position, you were a sales clerk for a while, and then you went on to this executive type of position. So I was accepted into that program, and I started to work at McCreary's. But as I said, you had to start as a salesperson, and I was unable to stand on my feet all day long for 3 days that I lasted as a salesperson. So I had to quit that job. So then I was out of work. So my parents were always urging me to say, what do you mean? I'm a college graduate. I'm not going to study shorthand. So somebody said I should write 200 letters to the top companies in the United States, telling them that I had graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Cornell, and now I was ready to begin my working career. And I sent out those 200 letters and was figuring people would be breaking down the door to my house after I sent them that. And I am still waiting today for the first response to any of those 200 letters because I didn't get one. So then I took my parents' advice and I went to the Brown Business School in Hempstead, New York on Long Island. And for 2.5 months, I studied shorthand, and my mother used to help me by dictating to me. And after 2.5 months, as soon as I finished shorthand, the next day I had a job working as a secretary.
And how long did you do that? How long did you stay as a secretary?
Well, I did that on and off for 4 years. The reason I say on and off was that my parents went to Miami Beach every winter. And so I used to work as a secretary. I was mostly working for Fawcett Publications, a magazine company that published True Confessions and other magazines. And I used to work in the non-winter, and then I would leave for the winter and go to Miami Beach with my parents. After the winter, I'd come back. My boss would take me back, and I would continue at Fawcett Publications. And I did that for 4 years when I realized that I was getting nowhere fast. Although I was at that time offered to, instead of being a secretary, to read the slush pile. That was unsolicited manuscripts that came in. And I was supposed to go to that job, but I felt that I wasn't getting anywhere fast. And when I was in Miami Beach, I was once driving and I drove past the University of Miami. And it's a lovely campus. And all my life, whenever I've driven by a college campus, I've wanted to go there. So I wanted to go to the University of Miami, but I had to remind myself that I had already graduated from college. So then I thought I could go to law school. So I applied to the law school at the University of Miami, and I was accepted, and I started law school.
And so you stayed in Miami and you went to law school there. And tell me, were there many women in your class at law school?
Yes. Everybody thinks there weren't, because in 1957, when I graduated from law school, 3% of the women lawyers in this country were women. But there were many more in my law school class, and a law professor friend of mine, Cynthia Bowman, who's a professor at Cornell, told me that schools like the University of Miami, which didn't have the prestige of the Harvard Business Law School, tended to take more women. So there were, I don't know, I have the records, maybe 9 or 10 women or 12 women in my class.
Do you remember how many were in the class total?
I have records on that, but offhand I don't.
Yeah.
But there were a good number of women.
Okay. So that's very interesting, because I think many of us think that at that time there were very, very few.
You didn't hear me.
No,
The more prestigious schools did not take so many women.
Right, I did hear you.
Other schools did.
Right. And then after law school, what did you do? Now you had your law degree. What did you do then after you graduated law school?
Well, I got to go back a little before that. When I've got to mention 2 things. My life was saved on about 4 occasions when I was a child. First of all, my mother had had 7 abortions before I was born, and I was supposed to be the 8th, but her favorite abortionist was out of the country having an affair with a ballerina. He took her to the Swiss Alps, and he wasn't there when my mother went for the abortion. So my mother had a second abortionist, and she was going to go see him. But my father, for some reason, and I should have asked him, said to her, let it be already. So that's why I was born. So that was the first time my life was saved. My life was saved the second time when we left Germany. My life was saved the third time when we weren't deported to Poland. And it was saved the 4th time when we were admitted to the United States. When 2 years later, Anne Frank's father wanted to come to the United States with his family, and they were not admitted. So the fact that my life was saved on all those occasions had a very strong impact on me. And it left me with the feeling that there was something I was supposed to do in the world to make it a better place, and that's why my life was saved. Now, when I became an adult, I learned that other Holocaust survivors have similar feelings. But I didn't know that. I was a child, and I walked around with this, and I couldn't tell anybody that because it was crazy. So I knew that I couldn't just get married and have a family because there was something I was supposed to do. Now, what I thought I wanted to do when I went to law school was that my parents in the Catskill Mountains of New York had a husband and wife legal team, Joe and Ethel Cooperman. And my father invested in second mortgages, and those were our lawyers. So I had the role model of a woman lawyer. So what I thought I'd do when I went to law school was practice law with my husband, like Joe and Ethel Cooperman did. The only problem with that was that I didn't have a husband. And also, in the summers after law school, I worked one summer for a law firm in Miami Beach, and I was disillusioned by some of the things I saw in that office, so that I no longer wanted to go into private practice. But I didn't have the slightest idea what I wanted to do, and I was in my senior year of law school and had no idea what would happen when I graduated. And then one day, I got a phone call from Minette Massey. She was a law professor at the University of Miami, but I never had a class with her. And she called me up and she said, "Sonia, did you see the notice on the bulletin board? There are recruiters from Washington coming down here to recruit from the Labor Department." And I said to her, "Yes, I saw that, but I have absolutely no interest in working in Washington, D.C., because we used to drive down there on the way to Florida, and I saw this big city with these tall buildings, and I figured if I worked there, who would ever know I existed?" So I told Minette I have no interest in that. And she said, "Well, I made an appointment for you at 2:00 on Friday." So I went to that appointment, and I was offered a job by the U.S. Department of Labor, and I took it. And then the Justice Department came down, and they had something called the Attorney General's Program for Honor Law Graduates. So they offered me a job, and I took that, and I turned down the Labor Department job, and I went to Washington.
And once you got to Washington, then what happened? How did you get to the EEOC, and tell us how all of that transpired?
Well, I went to Washington, and I had a choice of jobs within agencies that were part of the Justice Department. So I chose an agency that neither I nor anyone else had ever heard of, called the Office of Alien Property. And I took the job there. And what the Office of Alien Property did was, during every year, entitled to get their property back. And the Office of Alien Property decides whether they're going to get their property back. So I worked there for about a year and a quarter. When they announced that they were closing that agency, that for a short time it would move as from being an independent agency to Justice Department, and then it would close out altogether, and that we all had to find other jobs. But the Justice Department speaker who told us that also said they would get all of us other jobs. And a man was standing behind me, and he said to me, "They can't do that." I said, "What do you mean they can't do that? A government official just said he'll find all of us jobs." And the man said, "They can't do that." He was right. We had to find ourselves jobs. So I was looking for a job, and I called a man named Paul Elkind, who had worked at the Office of Alien Property, but was now working at the National Labor Relations Board. By the way, I am no longer seeing my own picture as a large picture, but I'm seeing some of the lady. Is that okay? Joe Aurora, how are you, Joe?
Sonia.
Oh, I got you back, Susan.
Okay, Joe, you need to mute though. Joe, you need to mute.
I thought I had. I'm sorry.
Mute. Okay.
No,
Sorry.
but I got her now again. Hello, Joe.
Okay.
Why do I have her? All right, Susan, I got you. So I called this man, Paul Elkin, who had been at the Office of Alien Property and was now working in the National Labor Relations Board. And I said to him, Paul, you got yourself another job. Can you recommend agencies that I might look for a job? And he said to me, why don't you come over here? There are openings here. You could interview here at the National Labor Relations Board. So I went there and I was interviewed by a man named Lou Schwartz. And he said to me, you are here because you have an interest in labor law. I said, no, I never gave it a thought. So he said, if you get this job, you plan to take courses in labor law. I said, never occurred to me. He said, when you were in college and high school, you studied labor law. I said, no, never. He said, why are you here? I said, I need a job. And he said, you're hired. So I went to work for the National Labor Relations Board. But it had never left my mind that I was supposed to do something. So after I'd been several years at the Labor Board and I got field experience in Pittsburgh and Los Angeles and came back, I had a friend named Jackie Williams. And I complained to her that there was some other job I was supposed to do, but I didn't know how to find it. And she said, oh, you're looking for a job. She was a graduate of Howard University, and she was Black. And she said to me that a former professor of hers, Charlie Duncan, had just been made general counsel of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, a brand new agency. She said, why don't you go over there and interview? So I called up Charlie Duncan. I came to his office for an interview. He said to me, you see this desk, which was full of papers? I said, yes. He says, those are all applications for the one job I have. He said, I don't know why, but I'm going to hire you. So that's how I came to the job I was meant to come to.
That's such an interesting story. And you felt that right away when he offered you that job?
Oh, no, it was the job that I was meant to do. That happened later when I was there.
Okay. Would you talk a little bit about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? I think many of us are not familiar with that particular piece of the Civil Rights Act.
Of 1964, which was meant primarily as a response to the movement for rights for Blacks. But Title VII prohibited employment discrimination by labor unions, employment agencies, and employers who were covered based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Initially, sex discrimination was not part of that act. But at the latter part of the debate on it, a segregationist congressman, Howard Smith, introduced sex as an amendment to also be included in the act. And his motives are not clear. On the one hand, he didn't want Blacks getting rights at the expense of white women. And he was close to Alice Paul, a feminist, and she felt that way. And on the other hand, it's entirely possible that he thought by adding that amendment, he would either slow down the passage of the act or kill it altogether. He voted against the act afterwards, as did his colleagues. But nobody wanted to get up and say sex discrimination should be removed from the act. So the act passed with a prohibition against gender discrimination in it.
And you spent a lot of time in that department with gender discrimination. Is that correct?
Not exactly.
Okay.
Not exactly. The department that I joined was the Office of the General Counsel. There was no separate section for gender discrimination. The agency was charged with enforcing the law that prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Though there were no separate departments, it was all one, the General Counsel's office.
What were some of the cases that you worked on, or some of the projects that you worked on while you were there?
The most significant case I worked on, and there's a book coming out about it on April 19th, in which I play a major role, involved the airline stewardesses. That was the most significant work I did while I was in the government. What it involved was the following. The airlines had different policies at different times with regard to what today we call flight cabin attendants, but in those days they were called stewardesses and pursers. At that time, stewardesses were hired only for domestic flights. Pursers were hired only for international flights. There were no special rules for pursers, although they did the same thing as stewardesses. Stewardesses, however, were grounded or terminated when they turned 32 or 35 or got married. They couldn't wear glasses. There were height and weight restrictions and other restrictions on them too. The stewardesses had already complained to the New York City Commission on Human Rights, but when Title VII opened its doors on July 2nd, 1965, they came streaming in to file complaints.
And you worked on that. And obviously the stewardesses succeeded.
I had the privilege of drafting the decision, finding that those policies by airlines in the United States violated Title VII.
Good. I wanted to ask you how you met Betty Friedan.
Well, when I first came to work at the EEOC, shortly after I came to work, Betty Friedan came into the General Counsel's office. In 1965, she had published a groundbreaking book called The Feminine Mystique. This was 1963. And in 1965, she came into my office. She thought she was going to write a second book about all the progress women had made since The Feminine Mystique came out. And she came to my office to interview the General Counsel and his deputy, who, by the way, was opposed to women's rights, as were other people at the EOC. But she saw me there, a woman. So she came over to me and she said, "What's really going on here? What's happening? What's doing?" So I figured if I told her the truth, I'd lose my job. The truth was that the EOC was not enforcing the law that prohibited gender discrimination. And there were two reasons for that. One was that they honestly didn't know how to enforce that law, because the law with regard to Blacks had been preceded by the movement for Black rights with a lot of discussion. So they knew what Blacks wanted, but the gender prohibition came in by surprise. There was no women's movement preceding it. So the EEOC didn't really know what women wanted in the area. And the second reason was that in the early days of the EEOC at headquarters, there were 100 people, and then most of them came there to do something about race discrimination. And they didn't want the commission's resources diverted to issues of gender discrimination. So they didn't do anything in that area. So I told, when Betty Friedan asked me what was doing, I figured if I tell her the truth, I'm going to lose my job. So I said, everything's fine here. Nothing special's happening. But 2 weeks later,
Came back.
Betty Friedan came back and she asked me again what was really happening at the agency. And she happened to catch me at a vulnerable time because I had just spoken to our executive director, Herman Adelsberg, another top official who was opposed to women's rights. And I was so broken up by my conversation with him that I took Betty Friedan into my office, and with tears streaming down my cheeks, I told her that what this country needed was an organization to fight for women like the NAACP fought for its constituents. And shortly thereafter, there was a meeting in June of '66 in Washington, the first meeting at which NOW was formed. And then in October, Halloween weekend, there was a second meeting at which NOW was formed. I was at that second meeting. There were 49 founders, and we formed the National Organization for Women.
Which is still in existence.
Not just in existence, a very active organization.
Right. So you stayed at the EEOC for how long?
I left there in 1973.
Okay. And then what did you do after you left the EEOC?
Then I went to work for a corporation called GTE in Stamford, Connecticut. And I was there for a while. And then I went to work for TRW in Cleveland, Ohio, where I was in charge of EEO and affirmative action. And then I returned to Washington and ended my career with HUD, the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Okay. Now, and so you retired in what year? From employment?
I retired equal employment in 1973,
right,
but that wasn't my retirement.
No, I meant after your last position and you retired from full employment.
Right.
But you haven't really retired.
Well,
you're very active. So I want to know, and everyone wants to know, what are some of the things that you have been doing since you are no longer employed in the workforce?
Well, women's rights for me and possibly for other people is the kind of thing that when you're in it, you don't get out of it. At least I don't. It is, I've been involved in women's rights now for 58 years. Some of the things I do is I'm frequently interviewed by people like you. I give speeches. I have a worldwide feminist email list to whom I daily send articles of interest to feminists. I continue to write and speak, and I feel that one of the things I can do is the fact that I had the privilege in my lifetime of living through a revolution in the rights of women in this country, and it has spread to other countries too. And I feel that it is my job to give witness to the revolution that I have participated in, the changes that I have seen, because when I give talks to young women, their mouths drop open. They don't know what happened in the past. They don't know the limited roles women had in this country in the past. And it's my privilege to let them know.
And what advice would you have? You do such a wonderful job of conveying to large groups. What would you like young women to know? What should they continue to do you think?
I don't go around telling people what they should do. But if they're interested in furthering women's rights, and there is much left to be done, what we've accomplished is way beyond what we started when we formed NOW. But what remains to be done is also huge. And I tell them that you cannot do that by yourself. It is best to join an organization like NOW or some other organization and work with like-minded people.
That's good advice and good suggestions. And before we open it up for questions, is there anything that you would like to leave with this group? You have so many stories to tell and so much. Is there anything else that you would like to leave with this group before questions?
I would like to tell this group that there are 3 books coming out which deal with women's issues, for which I was interviewed, and they might be interested in knowing about those 3 books. The first one is called The Great Stewardess Rebellion: How Women Launched a Workplace Revolution at 30,000 Feet. It's written by Nell McShane Wolfhart. It will be published this April 19th, but can be pre-ordered now. And it's about the stewardess cases of 50 years ago. The second book, let me see, I have a note on here. The second book is about one stewardess, Dusty Rhodes, who was a leader. And that book is called Dusty Rhodes: How the Women's Movement Took Flight, by Elaine Rock. And that's due either this year or next year. And the third book has the current working title of F is for Feminism, an American History. And it's written by, hold on, let me get her name. I don't have it here, but it's Clara Bingham. And that book is due out in 2024.
Thank you. Well, those of you who are aware, Sonia has been interviewed and given honors locally, so many. And unfortunately, during the pandemic year, Sonia, what was the big celebration locally? It was like the 100th year of—
Yes, of the vote.
Of women getting the vote.
Yes, right. And we had a committee here in Sarasota, which covered Sarasota and Manatee counties. And we had all kinds of activities with the schools and with other organizations to celebrate the 100th anniversary of women getting the vote. But the person in charge of that program was Kate Alexander of the Florida Studio Theater.
Right. And then the pandemic just kind of, crushed that quite a bit.
No, it didn't. It did not. I don't remember the pandemic crushing that at all. We had a year's worth of activities.
Good. Okay. Is there anyone that has questions? If you can just unmute yourselves. Is there any questions? I don't know if there are any in the chat. Or just unmute yourself if you have a question. Anybody? Okay, Sonia's website is up. If you go into the chat.
I have a question.
Yes.
And Sonia may have answered this to me on another level. Sonia, what's happened to the last state that's supposed to sign the, do the signing for ERA, for equal rights for all women?
Oh, the ERA is going to be tied up in litigation. I don't know how long. There are a couple of issues that have to be decided by the courts. One of them is whether the time in which the ERA could have been ratified has run. And that's not clear, but that's one of the issues. And the other one is some states that initially ratified the ERA then tried to take back their ratification. So that's the second issue. Can you ratify an amendment and then later retract that? So those are going to be in the courts, and I don't know how long that will take.
It's been years now. It's already been years.
No, it hasn't been years.
No, I mean to get as far as we've gotten.
Yes, correct.
Any other questions? Unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sonia, I have a question. Would you make some comments about the Supreme Court and the how that looks to you and what your hopes for the future or expectations might be?
It looks to me very bad. We have a court now with, I think, a 6-3 majority for conservatives. What is happening nationwide with regard to abortion is I have no words for it. There are some things happening on the other side that will help women get abortions. They will get more medication abortions. Certain states are now planning for abortion clinics that will welcome women from other states. Some employers are now offering to pay the expenses of their women employees if they have to go to another state. But I see abortion as the only big area where women have gone backwards, not because of anything they have done. It is some kind of insane hostility that men have to women, and some women too. It's not limited to men. Some women too are in the vanguard of opposing abortion. It's a very bleak picture.
Any other questions? Just unmute and ask your question.
Sonia, is there any one local issue in Sarasota or Manatee County that you think needs our help?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer because I've never operated with regard to women's rights, particularly with Sarasota Manatee. We used to have a chapter. When I moved to Sarasota Manatee, there was a now chapter here, and I belong to it, but we don't have a local chapter anymore. So what I do tends to be on the national front. So I really don't know that if there's anything specific to this area.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Well, Sonia, I would just like to thank you beyond for meeting with us tonight and giving us a very brief summary of your life story, which is very compelling. And I am truly honored that you are my friend and one of my oldest friends here in Sarasota. And we just thank you so much for being here. And just any other last words, Sonia?
Yeah, it just occurred to me, if anybody's interested, I have written a memoir of my life with humor, and it's called Eat First, You Don't Know What They'll Give You, The Adventures of an Immigrant Family and Their Feminist Daughter. It's available in the Sarasota Manatee Public Library, or you can buy it from Amazon.
Right, and it is, it's a very compelling story, and Sonia goes into far more detail about how her family got here and a lot of fun stories and with her life and where she lived and all of those kinds of things with great humor. So thank you. Oh, Sonia, go ahead.
It was a pleasure talking to this group, and thank you for a wonderful job, Susan.
Oh, well, thank you, Sonia. You make it very easy.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm so glad I had gotten to know you too at Humanistic Judaism.
Thank you. Ditto.
Yeah. Thank you all.